So, Albert Camus' The Plague seems to be the kind of novel that's perfect for the moment that we find ourselves living in. At least that's the pitch I'm going to try to make to you and see whether I can get you to agree or not. We'll see. All right, so a little bit of background. I hope you got a chance to watch that biopic on Camus that I posted. It was pretty interesting. A lot of stuff in there. He was born in 1913. A pied noir. That phrase refers to a French citizen who's born on Algerian soil. Algiers, North Africa, was a colony of France, and it no longer is. And Camus lived through the period of time where Algeria gained its independence and stopped being a French colony. It's an important part of his life. His relationship with Algiers was always complicated. His family, Camus' family, was poor, relatively poor, non-intellectual. So the video said there was no real books in his house. But as a French citizen, he enjoyed the rights that Arabs and the Berber indigenous people of Algiers did not. And that bothered him as a sensitive soul. He argued strenuously for the proper treatment of Arabs and Berbers and for some degree of independence from French rule. And he suffered for his complicated relationship. He said, "I suffer from Algeria at present as others suffer from the lungs." He, as you may know, had tuberculosis from the time he was 17 years old. A much worse disease then than it is now, and it's still bad now. So he knows all about lungs disease. He knows all about the pain of that, and so it's something that's very close to him. He made this point. Algeria, he was against colonization. He was against the racism. He was against the oppression. But he worried about the movements for independence. He thought, on the one hand, maybe they were being, pawns in a game of external powers like the, Soviet Union. He worried about violence. He was always his whole life a anti-violence, anti-death penalty person. And he says, I understand you want your freedom, but I think without French, interaction, you're going to get chaos, or you're going to get a kind of tyranny. And he says, all you bomb throwers, you're going to throw a bomb in a streetcar, and my mother could be in that streetcar. And he says, I believe in justice, but I will defend my mother before I will defend that kind of justice. And that line got him in a lot of trouble because people heard him as somehow still supporting the colonial aspect and the oppression of the Algerian people, which he didn't believe he was. Others thought he should have been much more radical, like Jean-Paul Sartre. He and Camus, they were friends for a while, but they broke over politics, in particular over the politics of Algeria. So it was difficult for him, and it pained him a lot. He, as I said, suffered from tuberculosis. That kept him out of the army, but he did work diligently for the resistance. He worked as a journalist. He founded a journal called Combat, which is perfect for the time. He married Francine Fourré, a pianist and a mathematician, and I mention that because I married a pianist and a mathematician. But unlike Camus, I think I think my wife would say that I treat her pretty well. Camus was not always very good to his wife, as you can learn in the video. He argued, Camus did, against Stalinism, and that got him in trouble with a lot of people because, remember, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And the Soviets were the enemies of Hitler. And the Soviets, even more the Americans, lost more of their lives and treasure fighting Hitler even than the Americans did. And when the Nazis were vanquished, France was favorable to the Americans, but also favorable to the communists. Because the communists were the sworn enemies of Hitlerism and Nazism and fascism. But Camus saw early that Stalin was bad news, and Sartre defended Stalin far too long. Camus didn't, but he certainly was no friend of Franco's Spain or fascism. He wrote The Plague in 1947 while he was recuperating and therefore cut off from his friends and work in Paris. in the Alps. So he knows a little bit about quarantining. In fact, he knows a lot about quarantining. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1957. He was the second youngest recipient of that award, second only to Rudyard Kipling. And then he was killed tragically in a car crash with his publisher in 1960. Died certainly too young. He wrote a number of important books. The Myth of Sisyphus. I don't know if you know that story, but Sisyphus is condemned to roll a giant stone, a giant ball, up a hill, only to have it roll down. And he's got to roll it back up again, and it rolls down. He rolls it up, and it rolls down forever. And Camus saw in that story something of our human condition, and we'll see that illustrated in the novel we're going to talk about. He wrote The Stranger and published in 1942 also, and we talked a little bit about the lead figure in that book, Meursault, the guy who doesn't care, the guy who seems to be utter nihilist. He's a whatever kind of guy, and I argue that he was misunderstood as the paradigm of what an existentialist should be like. In fact, he's just the opposite, nothing like his own author, Albert Camus. The Plague, which we'll talk about, The Rebel, was a nonfiction book that, again, took a lot of critique, especially from his friends like Sartre and Francis Chanson, who we saw in the video. I wrote another novel, The Fall, a bunch of short stories, but a lot of plays and essays and journals. He was very involved in the theater, as you learned, and he was also an athlete. In fact, he thought probably the best education he got in philosophy was from athletics, for courage and solidarity and teamwork and all those beautiful virtues of sports. I couldn't agree with him more. It's really right. Some of the main characters in the novel that we're going to talk about: Dr. Bernard Rieu, who is the healer, the physician who's trying his best to deal with all the suffering caused by the plague. An acquaintance of his, Jean Theroux, who seems to be an aesthete kind of guy. He's very interested in the artists and the musicians and the Spanish dancers, and he seems disconnected until he's not. Ramon Rambert is a journalist who he gets assigned a story to go to this town, Oran, and follow up on the story. And while he's there, it has nothing to do with the plague hits. And while he's there, the town gets shut down. He's quarantined. He's not allowed to leave. So all he thinks about is how is he going to get out? How is he going to escape? He's not meant to be there. Why am I here? I got to get back to my lover. I got to get out until he doesn't. Joseph Grand, maybe the most interesting character we'll talk about, but he's in the background. He's a government functionary. He's a clerk. He fills out all the forms. He keeps all the spreadsheets and the ledgers. That's his job, not very exciting in any way. He also fancies himself a writer, and that plays into the story a little bit. There's this guy Cotard. We meet him early in the story because he's trying to kill himself, and he's trying to hang himself, and he's rescued from that. He's unsuccessful in that attempt. And he's a guy who, in a way, finds himself when the plague hits. I mean, all these characters do to a certain extent. Cotard, he thrives. He's got a past. The past can't get to him anymore. He's been closed off from his past. Now it's a new beginning for him during the plague, and he becomes a profiteer, and he's thriving quite well, thank you very much. And then Father Panelou, the priest, Jesuit, and he gives two very important sermons during the course of the story. One, blaming the citizens of Oran for the plague. They brought it upon themselves by forgetting about God. Later, he gives a sermon in which he argues for the complete and utter acceptance of the will of God, no matter what it brings. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we go. So those are the main characters. There's others. All the page references in these slides is from my copy, the Modern Library edition of The Plague. That's the best I could do at the time. I don't have a copy of the latest print edition, so I can't help you with that, but the pages would be approximate in case you ever get interested in it. So we don't have a lot of time, and we only have today to talk about this. What I hope to do is do a full recording to be able to post as well, if I can get to that. But what I did was I pulled out some quotes, some passages in order, going in order from the beginning to the end of the book, that I just wanted to gloss a little bit, just put some comments on. And in your final discussion forum, maybe you'll be able to think about some of these ideas, some of these passages I pulled out. Okay, so first, the response of the town is, if you got a chance to see the story, people start noticing rats. Rats come out of wherever they're normally hiding away, and they're dying. And they're like, what's up with these rats? They're all coming out, and they're all dying. Right after that, the people start getting sick, and before you know it, they recognize that it's the Bubonic Plague. So he writes in the story, the narrator does, everybody knows that pestilences have a way of recurring in the world. Yet somehow we find it hard to believe in the ones that crash down on our heads from a blue sky. There have been many plagues as wars in history, yet always plagues and wars take people equally by surprise. I mean, we all went to school, we all studied history, we all knew that there were, the Spanish flu and the Bubonic Plague, and we all know about these things. And yet every time they happen, people say, I'm shocked. How could that have happened? How could this be happening to us? It happens all the time in history, not all the time, but regularly in the course of history. And he goes on, in fact, like our fellow citizens, Ryu, the doctor was caught off his guard, and we should understand his hesitations in the light of this fact, and similarly understand how he was torn between conflicting fears and confidence. When a war breaks out, people say, it's too stupid, it can't last long. But though a war may well be too stupid, that doesn't prevent it from lasting. Stupidity has a knack of getting its way. Think about that line. As we should see if we were not always so much wrapped up in ourselves. In this respect, our townfolk were like everybody else, wrapped up in themselves. In other words, they were humanists. And he means something specific by humanists here. They disbelieved in pestilences. A pestilence isn't a thing made to man's measure. Therefore, we tell ourselves that pestilence is a mere bogey of the mind, a bad dream that will pass away. But it doesn't always pass away. And from one bad dream to another, it is men who pass away. And the humanists, first of all, because they haven't taken their precautions. Why? Because this stuff is never going to happen to us. Why prepare? Our townsfolk were not more to blame than others. They forgot to be modest, that was all. And they thought that everything still was possible for them, which presupposed that pestilences were impossible. That's a presumption. They went on doing business, arranged for journeys, and formed views. How should they have given a thought to anything like plague, which rules out any future, cancels journeys, silences the exchange of views? They fancied themselves free, and no one will ever be free so long as there are pestilences. In your final discussion forum, I'm going to ask about freedom. And are we free? And what's the nature of our freedom? And what do you make of this line? No one will ever be free so long as there are pestilences. And many people have taken Camus' book as a metaphor, not just about a particular disease, but anything that rules out a future, that cancels journeys, that silences the exchange of views, can be thought of as a pestilence. Can we be free so long as there's pestilences? One of the most striking consequences of closing of the gates was, in fact, the sudden deprivation befalling people who were completely unprepared for it. Mothers and children, lovers and husbands and wives who had a few days previously taken it for granted that their parting would be a short one, who had kissed one another goodbye on the platform and exchanged a few trivial remarks, sure as they were of seeing one another again after a few days or at most a few weeks, duped by our blind human faith in the near future, and little, if at all, diverted from their normal interest by this leave-taking. All these people found themselves, without the least warning, hopelessly cut off, prevented from seeing one another again, or even communicating with one another. That happened to people in the story. For instance, Dr. Yu, his own wife was ill, was sent to a sanatorium out of town. He thought he'd be reunited with her relatively soon, but when the plague came and the town was quarantined, he was cut off by surprise. Look at us. Didn't we all sort of wave at each other and say, well, see you after the break. Have a nice break. See you in a week. And what happens? We don't see each other again, except this way, electronically. And they didn't even have that option. So that's it. That's the same as what's going on with us. And he talks about exile. He says, thus the first thing that plague brought to our town was exile. Now, nobody was forced to leave. exile came to the town, and the narrator is convinced that he could set down here as holding good for all the feeling he personally had and to which many of his friends confessed. It was undoubtedly the feeling of exile, that sensation of a void within, which never left us, that irrational longing to hark back to the past or else to speed up the march of time, and those keen shafts of memory that stung like fire. And then we realized that the separation was destined to continue. We had no choice but to come to terms with the days ahead. Did we not feel that? Did we talk about this? That something felt kind of empty all of a sudden? We got something ripped out of us. Remember, the world, our being in the world, says Heidegger, is not we are inside of something separate from us called the world. We are our being in the world. And when that referential system of significance gets broken up, we feel the void, the nothingness, the anxiety. All that is from this Heideggerian and existential kind of philosophy. But note this, still, he says, if it was an exile, it was for most of us an exile in one's own home. The word home in German is Heim, and Heidegger says that when we are in a state of anxiety, we feel unheimlich. That gets translated as uncanny, but it means like out without a home, without a place, without our own place. So most of us now are in exile in our own home. We're not at home in our own homes. I'll just take my own case as an example. My home feels different to me now. Not just because we have a couple of classrooms set up in the office here and in the dining room, not just because of that, but even when my wife and I are not working, having classes or whatever, but we're just in our home doing what we probably would have done anyway, which is prepare for classes or grade or whatever it is we have to do. It still feels different because it's disconnected from all the other concerns and cares that we had BC, before COVID. So just the very vibe of the place feels a little bit, and maybe sometimes a lot of bit different to us. That's that uncanny feeling. I'm at home, this is my place, all this is familiar, but somehow it's a little bit not familiar anymore because of circumstances. And then feeling as one feels, I put it. Moreover, in this extremity of solitude, none could count on any help from his neighbor. Now, just so you know, this passage doesn't mean getting help like if you went to the store for your neighbor or you shared a mask or because you sewed them a mask or whatever. No, this is emotional help he's talking about now. Each had to bear the load of his troubles alone, and if by some chance one of us tried to unburden himself or say something really genuine about his feelings, the reply he got, whatever it might be, usually wounded him. And then it dawned on him that he and the man with him weren't talking about the same thing. For while he himself spoke from the depths of long days of brooding upon his personal distress, and the image he had tried to impart had been slowly shaped and proved in the fires of passion and regret, this meant nothing to the man to whom he was speaking, who pictured a conventional emotion, feeling as one feels, a they emotion, a grief that is traded on the marketplace, mass-produced. Whether friendly or hostile, the reply always missed fire, and the attempt to communicate had to be given up. All right, it's the flip side of idle talk. Right? We're talking to each other about what we feel, but the communication isn't going on. This was true of those, at least for whom silence was unbearable. Since the others could not find the truly expressive word, they resigned themselves to using the current coin of language, the commonplaces of plain narrative, of anecdote, and of their daily paper. Right? So in these cases, too, even the sincerest grief had to make do with the set phrases of ordinary conversation. Only in those terms could the prisoner of the plague ensure sympathy of their concierge and the interest of their hearers. They talk, idle talk. This is Heidegger. Right? This is something we've learned about all along, that in coping with these situations, we tend to fall, Heidegger's word, into our average everydayness. There are parallels in the book I'm just pointing out. At first, he said, at present, they were not unemployed. They were merely on holiday. When we first got locked down, it's like, oh, this is just temporary. I got a couple of days off. This will be good. And then it wasn't. Right? And how about this? Naturally, the picture houses, that's the theaters, benefited by the situation and made money hand over fist. Now, In the story of the plague, it's an epidemic. The town is quarantined from the rest of the world. We have a pandemic, so our movie theaters aren't open. But what about Netflix? Lots of businesses are going down. Netflix isn't going down. Any of those streaming services aren't going down. They're making money because that's what people have to do with themselves. Another passage, and while a good many people adapted themselves to confinement and carried on their humdrum lives as before, there were others who rebelled and whose one idea now was to break loose from the prison house. That's among them is the journalist Rambert, who, remember, he ended up locked down in Oran, but he was just there for some other reason, and he can't figure out why he has to be locked down. Why does he get to leave? Well, he doesn't get to leave. At first, the fact of being cut off from the outside world was accepted with a more or less good grace, as much as people would have put up with any other temporary inconvenience that interfered with only a few of their habits. Right? When it first said, "Hey, could you stop going out?" Oh, I could cut it back at first. But now they had abruptly become aware that they were undergoing a sort of incarceration under the blue dome of sky, already beginning to sizzle in the fires of summer. They had a vague sensation that their whole lives were threatened by the present turn of events. And in the evening, when the cooler air revived their energy, this feeling of being locked up like criminals prompted them sometimes to foolhardy acts. And if you read the papers, look online, in the last 24, 48 hours, there were these protests around the country, including in Pennsylvania and Harrisburg. Liberate us. We're incarcerated. Liberate us. We don't care about the social distancing or masks or all this kind of stuff. It's foolhardy. No regard for science. No regard for the dangers of what they're suggesting. They're pent up. They can't take it anymore. They can't be alone with themselves. They just can't take it. They see it as some kind of a deeper meaning of losing their freedom, and they're having trouble with that. Well, here's this book that's noting the same thing about us. A character who's not named makes a very interesting observation at one point. He says, if only it had been an earthquake, a good bad shock, and there you are. You count the dead and the living, and that's an end of it. But this here damn disease, even them who haven't got it can't think of anything else. Right? An earthquake is terrible, but if the earthquake happened and your house didn't fall down, well, that's it then. You know it, you lived. Your neighbors fell down, it's terrible, but that's it. It's over. Right? And the people who aren't affected can move on. But now we don't know who has what, and it's bothering all of us. We can't stop talking about this disease. Some other parallels. In spite of the growing shortage of paper, which has compelled some of the newspapers to reduce their pages, a new paper has been launched, The Plague Chronicle. All right, just wanted to point that page out. All of the major venues have now started new endeavors. The Philadelphia Inquirer has a special COVID posting. The New York Times has a special COVID post. The Washington Post. Everybody's coming out with their special news because we just get wrapped up in all this news. This is what we talk about, and eventually he says these newspapers, which are supposed to give us information, eventually have a bunch of advertisements in them of new infallible antidotes against the plague. Sure enough, you could see those same kinds of things being advertised today, that, this will fix it, this is the answer, despite all the warnings to not fall for that kind of stuff. Social distancing did happen there, not because the government ordered it and they gave guidelines, but people did it naturally. On page 10, a queer thing is how the passengers all try to keep their backs turned to their neighbors, twisting themselves into grotesque attitudes in the attempt. The idea being, of course, to avoid contagion. At every step, a cataract of men and women is disgorged from the streetcar, and each in haste to put a safe distance between himself and herself and the rest. You know how it is if you live in a populous area, you try to go out for a walk, and you kind of got to turn your head and try not to aim in the general direction of other people. My wife and I, we go running, where somebody's on the same side of the street, we cross over the other side of the street, cross back, because we're trying to avoid these contagions. Some of the signs of the epidemic, restaurants were putting up signs about being guaranteed sterilized. I get emails constantly now from different, vendors. I'll give you an example. Domino's just sticks in my head recently. Every couple of days I get email message from Domino's telling me exactly how the pizza's prepared, how it's no touch from the time it comes out of the oven, and no touch delivery and all that kind of stuff. Again, just like in the novel. People spend very freely. What's interesting, there's a great deal of unemployment right now, record numbers. But when I go out for a walk or a run on recycle day, I've been seeing a lot of boxes. I see two kinds of boxes out there: wine boxes, liquor boxes, and I see big screen TV boxes. We were trying to count up how many we saw the other day and try to find the winner. The winner was a 70-incher, so somebody went all in for a big new TV. Because we got to find something to do, and people, the story says, drug themselves with talking. Don't repeat this, but every Friday we have virtual happy hour with my brothers and sister and their spouses, and every Friday. But BC, before COVID, I didn't talk to them every Friday. I might talk to them every couple of months. Right? It's not like we have all of a sudden like developed deeper concerns for each other. I like to think we love each other and conserve each other, but we were doing other things. Now we got our fears, we got our nerves, and we don't talk through all that stuff, but we talk, and that's kind of our drug, and maybe a glass of wine. But that's a kind of drug to try to keep us chill, try to keep us calm during this disaster. Now, what about is there a good side? I told you guys, I tried my best not to have too much of a grin on my face when I said it, but I said, this is the perfect time, the perfect learning moment, teachable moment for existentialist thought in the midst of a crisis like this. But I want to say that I didn't want to look too gleeful about that, because as I told you, I would have done anything if I could to make this never have happened at all, and have to teach you when times are good and hope for the best. Well, listen to this passage. Taru and Rue are talking to each other. Taru says, however, you, doctor, think like the priest, that the plague has its good side. The priest thought it's a good side. This will bring people back to God. You think, don't you, doctor, that it opens men's eyes and forces them to take thought. And the doctor says, well, so does every ill that the flesh is heir to. What's true of all the evils in the world is true of plague as well. It helps men to rise above themselves. Okay, that's hey, you know what? This is a moment. This is maybe, like Heidegger would say, a moment where authenticity, might be possible. But notice what he writes next, what he says next. All the same, when you see the misery it brings, you'd need to be a madman or a coward or stone blind to give in tamely to the plague. That's what I mean. I'll use this moment to the best of my ability, and whether you guys, hear or take it up or not, it's on you. But, I would much rather this never happen. I mean, anything I could do to be able to be back in class with you, to be able to hug my grandkids, I would pay it if I had it. But there are some people, there are really, who say, this is great. Humans have messed up the earth so bad, they deserve it. Maybe there'll be a big dieback, and maybe we can all start over, and wouldn't that be great? No, it would not be great. I don't want a big dieback. I don't want to go back to primitivism, and I don't think you do either. But still, it's not to say that some good can't come of these things. Not that we would bring it on in order to have that good, but now that it's here, maybe we could find some good in it. The question about God comes up. Taru asked the doctor, "Why do you do all this stuff, doctor? Why do you show such devotion to trying to heal these sick people, considering you don't believe in God?" And Ryu said, that he'd already answered that if he, the doctor, believed in an all-powerful God, he would cease curing the sick and leave that to him. Hey, if God could fix everything, I'll just put my feet up, let God go to work, I'll watch. But Ryu says no one in the world believed in a God of that sort. No, not even Panalu the priest, who believed that he believed in such a God. I love that line. He believed that he believed in a God who was going to fix everything. But he didn't really believe it. He didn't existentially believe that. Not really. And he says, and this is proven by the fact that no one ever threw himself on Providence completely. Anyhow, in this respect, Ryu believed himself to be on the right road. And what's the right road? Fighting against creation as he found it. Now, I want you to take a moment and think about that line too. What is Dr. Ryu doing? Creation as he finds it has death in it. And what is the job, the task, the project of Ryu? Cure, heal, try to prevent death. do everything he can. But creation, the way the world is, has a lot of death in it. Why bother? Why do that? Right? He says, well, that's what I'm doing. He says, I have no idea what's awaiting me or what will happen when all this ends. For the moment, I know this. There are sick people and they need curing. Later on, perhaps they'll think things over, and so shall I. But what's wanted now is to make them well. I defend them as best I can. That's all. Right? That's Ryu's statement of his own motivation here. I'm a doctor. I do what doctors do. That's it. I don't do it for my heavenly reward. I don't worry about what the meaning of all this is. I see sick. I try to get it healed. That's what I do. He says, I never managed to get used to seeing people die. I just want to put my 2 cents worth in here. Long before I heard of existentialism or Camus or anybody, I've said this I've said this line 1,000 times in my life, maybe more. I just can't get used to it. Even people who are old and sick, and I think, boy, I wish they wouldn't have to suffer so much. I don't get it. I'm a philosopher. I was before I was a professional philosopher. I asked questions. I wondered. I wanted to know. It's just the kind of kid I was, the kind of kid I am still, I guess. And that's just something that that resonates with me. I cannot get used to it. And when I read this line, I thought I was reading a kindred spirit. And Ryu says, that's all I know. Since the order of the world is shaped by death, mightn't it be better for God if we refuse to believe in him, like in that way, and struggle with all our might against death without raising our eyes toward heaven where he sits in silence? He thinks, in a way, maybe we're even being unfair to God by expecting him to fix all this stuff for us. Maybe that's unfair. Maybe we just don't even get God. He says, but I don't know. All I know is I'm fighting the fight, and I know I'm going to lose, but I don't care. Well, does that make him a hero? Right? That show some of us watched the other night with Lady Gaga and everybody else, the Jimmys and Colbert. We applauded our heroes. I love watching those videos of 7 o'clock in New York City when everybody's out in their balcony banging pots and pans and applauding. I'm getting chills just thinking about that now. It's great. So we want to honor our heroes. But Ryu has something interesting to say, and you should read it. But I'll say a little bit about it. The doctor doesn't like calling people heroes. He doesn't like that. He's talking about a group of volunteers. In his story, the sanitation crew go out and risk their lives because they might contract the disease to try to clean up the town and prevent other people from getting the plague. Aren't they heroes? He says, well, when you do that, he says, he thinks attributing overimportance to the good selfless acts one performs implies that normally human nature is callous and apathetic. He says, if we single out some people and say they're heroes, we're implying that there's something abnormal about what they do, something super special about what they do, that they're somehow different from the mass of people. And you will see in this book that Ryu, and I think Camus himself, had a generally optimistic view about people. He thought you'll see in the end of the book, he says there's more good than bad in people. Bad comes from ignorance, just like Plato would have taught. But we're good. And so what's going on is those people are doing, what they're called to do normally. And even if they're risking their lives, he talks about this. He says, and the question is not one of knowing what punishment or reward attends the making of this calculation, whether to do it or not. The question is that of knowing whether 2 and 2 do make 4. He gives an example of the math teacher. He says, we don't applaud the math teacher for teaching that 2 + 2 = 4. That's what math teachers do. That's just what they do. We might applaud them for, taking up that job, but that's just what they do. Right? He thinks these townsfolk are like the math. They're just doing what ought to be done, reality. For those of our townfolk who risked their lives in this predicament, the issue was just this: whether or not plague was in their midst and whether or not they must fight against it. Boom. That's it. Not trying to be heroes, not worrying about what it all means. They see what has to happen and they make it happen. That's a big idea for Camus. Now, how you feel about that, what you think about what he's saying here about heroism, you might reflect about that. I'm not 100% sure how I think about it, but I think it's an interesting point that he tries to make here. So what do you do? He says, the best way of making yourself useful in a terrible time like this is to do your work well. Otherwise, all the rest is useless. If everybody, whoever, yes, the doctors and nurses and the grocery store workers and the package deliverers, yes, they have to do their job or we're all in trouble. But Camus' point is everybody's got to do what they can do. Whatever it is, different things, but whatever it is, they got to do it and do it well. He says a little further on in a conversation with the journalist, however, there's one thing I must tell you. This is Ryu speaking. There's no question of heroism in all this. It's a matter of common decency. That's an idea which may make some people smile. It's naive, but the only means of writing a plague is common decency. And Rambert says, what do you mean by common decency? He says, I don't know what it means for other people, but in my case, I know it consists of doing my job. Right? We got a crisis here. We ought to respond with common decency. What does that mean? To do our jobs and try to do them well. Now that brings us to grand. Ryu doesn't use the word hero here, but that's really what he means. He says this guy Joseph Grand, the guy who's the functionary, the government clerk, he's the embodiment of quiet courage. He just said, I'll do what I have to do, and I'll do it the best I can. He did his job, and Ryu thinks that's what I'm talking about. Everybody's got to be like Ryu. No big deal, no big meaning behind it, just do the job. Now, what's interesting about Ryu, I don't know if you got a chance to read the story, you'll find that he's kind of an odd duck in a way, because in his spare time, he's trying to write a novel or a great book. But he can't get past the first line. The whole story, he keeps coming back to Dr. Ryu, says, look, read it now. Read this first sentence now. Do I think I have it right? And the doctor would say, that sounds pretty good. And he looks at it, Grand does, he goes, I don't think so. No, it needs something. I'm using the wrong conjunction, or I'm not using the right adjective. And he just keeps reworking this one line. And there's a metaphor in this. Think of what Tarot says the plague is all about. The meaning of the plague is the same thing over and over again. That's like your day. I ask you, what's new? Nothing's new. You know that, right? It's just we're doing the same thing over and over again. That's what this plague is for us. Think of that myth of Sisyphus, rolling the ball up the hill, letting it roll back down, rolling the ball up the hill, letting it roll back down, right? Over and over and over again, and you don't win. Right? Grant's trying to write his book, but he can't get past the first line over and over. He keeps reworking this line, even though the book's never getting finished. Dr. Ryu, over and over, he keeps trying to deal with the people who get the plague, and people are going to keep dying. Even the people he cures, or at least gets them well again, the few that he does, I mean, guess what? In time, they're all going to die anyway. Right? I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but that's how it goes. That's creation. Right? That's the reality of things. So why do it? If you take the 10,000-foot view of us, everything looks absurd. We fight and fight and fight to heal, even though in the end everybody's going to die anyway. Why bother? Right? Nihilism. But Camus says we don't live at a 10,000-foot view from ourselves. We live in our skins, our own skin, our own condition. What do? We do our jobs. Doctors heal, writers write, teachers teach, students learn. That's what we do. We do that. That's where all the meaning of life is. And it's a great, deep, powerful meaning to do your job and do it well, to live with a kind of common decency. That's what Camus is teaching. So that rolling the ball up the hill from an abstract point of view looks absurd. That's what he means by the absurdity of life. But that's not what it looks like to Sisyphus. He admires Sisyphus because he keeps going. He admires Dr. Ryu because he keeps going. He especially admires Joseph Grand because he keeps going. That's the important point for Camus. The they, plays a role in this as well. In the story, he says, what did I make of these exiles in their own homes? What impression did they make? He says they didn't make any impression. They look like everybody else, right? They just did everything the way everybody else does. They drank their beer, they nursed their sick, they idled or doped themselves with work, filed documents to the office, or played the phonograph at home without betraying any difference from the rest of us. In other words, they had ceased to choose for themselves. The plague had leveled out discrimination. And we know that idea of leveling comes from Heidegger, from Being in Time, the idea of our average everydayness and our fallenness. Everybody is sort of interchangeable with everybody else. One is doing what one does. they are doing what they say. And it's interesting to think with Camus, the tension between our they selves and his promotion of common decency, which is doing your job. Even if it doesn't have a cosmic meaning of filling out the ledgers, it's not saving anybody's life necessarily, but you fill out the ledgers anyway because that's your job. What's the tension between this they self and the ones who do their jobs? Worth pondering. There's a fear of the neighbor, right? Because we like we said earlier, we turn our heads. A neighbor early on, new neighbor bought us over a little cake in a plastic, commercially made little bundt cake thing in a plastic container, and I asked, set it on the porch, pick it up later, and kind of wiped it down. It was a beautiful gesture, very thoughtful, very kind. But we realized that in a moment of vulnerability, something could happen, and we get worried. So maybe we turn to religion, and same thing happened in this story. He says that, they returned to religion, but they replaced the normal religious practice by something more or less extravagant and superstitious. They were readier to wear the prophylactic medals of St. Roche than to go to Mass. St. Roche, I had to Google it, is the patron saint of the Bubonic Plague sufferers. So everybody had their St. Roche medals on or whatever. But here, just a couple days ago, not too many days ago in the New York Times, there was this, article about turn to religion, but it's not the normal religion. In some cases, religious fervor has led people toward cures that have no grounding in science. In others, it has drawn them to sacred places or rites that would increase the risk of infection. In Myanmar, a prominent Buddhist monk announced that a dose of 1 lime and 3 palm seeds, no more, no less, would confer immunity. In Iran, a few pilgrims were filmed licking Shiite Muslim shrines to ward off infection. And in Texas, the preacher Kenneth Copeland braided televangelism with telemedicine, broadcasting himself, one trembling hand, here's me, my hand outstretched, if you can see that, as he claimed he would cure believers through their screens. Look, I'm curing you, curing you, right? Not the normal religion, because that we don't trust that. We're looking for some kind of magic instead of religion. The story talks about the worries over maintaining the food supply for profiteers. You probably heard about that guy that bought $40,000 or whatever it was of toilet paper and hand sanitizer, and obviously can't do a thing with them. Tried to get his money back, and they said no, forget it. Poor families are in much greater straits, while the rich, can retire to their second homes and try to stay away from the rest of the hoi polloi. Same today, same as in that story. Taru, really interesting character, and he's got a nice long speech, very much worth reading. But he says, I've learned modesty. All I maintain is that on this earth there are pestilences and there are victims. And it's up to us, so far as possible, not to join forces with the pestilences. If The Plague, this novel, is a metaphor, maybe it's a metaphor for the German occupation of France and of Paris. That's a plague. But maybe it's a plague of poverty, a pestilence of poverty. Maybe it's a pestilence of racism or nativism. There's all kinds of pestilences that we either fight, or we fall victim to, or we even help to promote, whether we know we're doing it or not. And Taru says you got to decide what side you're on. Taru wants to be a saint, and Rue says that's kind of funny because you don't believe in God. And Taru says, yeah, that's it. My question is, can one be a saint without God? That's the problem. In fact, the only problem I'm up against. And you think, well, that sounds pretty good. Who cares? Not who cares, but it doesn't really matter if there's God or not. The idea is, can you be a saint? And Ryu says, but I feel more fellowship with the defeated than with the saints. Heroism and sanctity don't really appeal to me, I imagine. What interests me is being a man. And being a man, being a person, being a human being is being decent, practicing common decency, which means just doing what needs to be done. You don't need to be told what to be done. You can find what to be done. Are we going to come back to normal? Is there any such thing as starting with a clean slate? Oh, we got to talk about it. What's the plague in the end? All those folks are saying it was plague. We've had the plague here. You almost think they expect to be given medals for it. But what does that mean, plague? Just life. No more than that. There are always pestilences. There are always plagues. You had plagues in your life. We're in this together. That's what makes it different. But there are always obstacles. There are always struggles. How do we get through them? We work our way through. Ryu says, when he bears witness to plague-stricken people, he could have easily said life-stricken people then. And it's never over. It's Sisyphus. We always have to keep working, keep moving forward. That's why I think this book is a comforting book. It didn't make me more scared of my situation. It made me more aware of my situation and maybe more patient with it and understanding of others. And that's my pitch for this amazing book, this great book. We're out of time, so I'll leave you with a lesson of the book and a question. The lesson, I think, from Camus and his main character, Dr. Ryu, is there are more things to admire in men than to despise. We know that these crises bring out both the best and the worst of us, but maybe the best of us. And Camus writes, this tale gives the record of what had to be done and what assuredly would have to be done again in the never-ending fight against terror and its relentless onslaughts, despite their personal afflictions, by all who, while unable to be saints, but refusing to bow down to pestilences, strive their utmost to be healers. And I guess the question is, what will be our tale when this is all said and done? What's going to be our story? How will we have been?